Quick question. In this clip, is Tucker Carlson making a statement of fact?
Remember the facts of the story. These are undisputed. Two women approached Donald Trump and threatened to ruin his career and humiliate his family if he doesn't give them money. Now, that sounds like a classic case of extortion.
If this sounds familiar, it's because those two women that he's talking about are Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, whose names you may recognize from recent news when the question of hush money paid to Daniels led to 34 felony convictions for Donald Trump.
Guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying his business records, hiding how he reimbursed his former fixer for paying off a porn star before the election.
Tucker doesn't buy the mainstream media version, though, so he enlightens us. Remember, these facts of the story were undisputed. He told us what these women did. This wasn't hush money. They approached Donald Trump and threatened to ruin his career. Doesn't that sound like a classic case of extortion? Except Tucker didn't claim any of that. At least not according to a federal district judge, who said that his lawyers persuasively argued that this was non-literal commentary and that he wasn't stating actual facts.
Remember the facts of the story. These are undisputed.
This was the decision in 2020's McDougal v. Fox News Network, that we shouldn't believe Tucker Carlson when he speaks. This generated a bunch of headlines at the time, article after article, holding this up like some kind of smoking gun, saying, hey, even Fox News thinks that they lie. But in the carnal pleasure of making fun of Tucker Carlson in 2020, I think all these headlines missed the real story. The real shocking thing to me is that Tucker Carlson could literally claim he was stating undisputed facts, and when he was called out for defamation, the law had his back. In fact, a whole host of people have his back. From the advertisers that funded this program, to the producers that greenlit this piece, to the court that signed off on this as legally protected speech, we have a media ecosystem that not only produces misinformation, it's designed for it. I want to talk to you today about the things that media literacy can't fix. After all, no matter how literate you are, you can't read facts that aren't there. In the summer of 2021, my friend and I were stopped at a gas station in Arizona by a man named Larry, who asked if he could interview us for his YouTube channel. My friend didn't notice the "Don't Tread on Me" style t-shirt he was wearing, and so cheerily agreed on our behalf to do the interview. I, however, suspected that Larry had asked us in particular because we were two young people wearing masks in an otherwise maskless part of the country at this time. Two young libs that he could own on camera. Curiosity got the better of me though, so we talked with Larry and he recorded. Larry told us that we were potentially foolish to have taken the vaccine, that it could be dangerous. I pointed out that vaccination rates correlated with less COVID by county at the time, demonstrating their efficacy to me. But Larry waved those numbers away by just saying, oh, no. Those numbers are made up, to control you. I could tell you about more details of the conversation here, but the whole thing basically went like that, where Larry's fears became problems that society needed to answer for, and even when the answer was relatively clear, that didn't mean that he accepted it. This moment stands out in my memory whenever I think about misinformation, because in that conversation with Larry, it felt like I was talking to the personification of misinformation, someone who distrusted all available evidence and believed what he wanted to. I think we all know a Larry in one form or another. Misinformation became something of a household concern around 2016 with the Trump campaign.
You are fake news.
And Brexit.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organizations from acronyms.
Mutating during COVID.
Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
And eventually just kind of existing in every conflict now.
They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable with what misinformation does, both to people and society for good reason. So solutions have been something of a hot topic in the last decade. And the most popular answer, by far, is media literacy. Media literacy has been championed by educators, activists, video essayists, and random people online who claim to care about the truth. The prevailing discussion centers media literacy as an antidote for a post-truth world. Sure, the rich and powerful may tell lies to everybody, but if they don't believe them, then who cares? The National Association for Media Literacy Education, or NAMELY, defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. My friend Zoe, who you'll see throughout this video, recently made a video of her own on this topic where she stress tested this definition in various ways.
The Zoe B take is that media literacy is having intellectual humility and curiosity for or about. I'm not sure which preposition to use here. So it's having intellectual curiosity and intellectual humility for the things that you are consuming, acknowledging that your perspective is not the only one, that there is a multitude, perhaps even like an infinite amount of perspectives that one can have in media or have about media. And curiosity meaning wanting to actually figure out what those different perspectives are. And so that's why I think those two things are like necessary.
I'm just going to accept the definition from Namely for the purposes of this video, mostly because I read a lot of work from them, and definitions aren't my main focus right now, as long as we have a working one that is broadly agreed upon. Oh, also, I'm almost exclusively talking about news and informational media literacy in this video, so if you came here to see me dunk on random Attack on Titan takes, sorry, wrong video. The popular understanding of media literacy that you might find on Twitter or YouTube is pretty optimistic, and I think that that's for good enough reason. But the popular conception often leaves out a lot of the actual history. Media literacy didn't simply spring into existence in 2016 when we realized that people don't trust the news. In 2009, writing for the first volume of Namely's Journal of Media Literacy Education, scholars Renee Hobbs and Amy Jensen described the complex, evolving history of media literacy education as a highly contextualized activity that takes many forms. It's easy to see media literacy as an extension of the practice of rhetoric, developed during the 5th century BC to teach the art of politics through the development of oratory and critical thinking. It's also possible to see its roots in the emergence of film as a tool for teaching and learning, particularly in the development of language, critical analysis, and literacy skills. They also recognize that the field is incredibly diverse in its opinion on the purpose of media literacy, often described through the tension between protection and empowerment, two opposing, or sometimes complementary, goals that media literacy education can work towards. Early 20th century media literacy study arose from the analysis of propaganda, wondering if education could protect readers from undue influence. More recent conceptions have focused on civic engagement and empowering students with the technical ability to participate in an increasingly complex communication environment. The history that leads up to modern media literacy is broad and far-reaching, drawing from many disciplines like technology, communication studies, media studies, education, political science, rhetoric, and the broader humanities. It's a real beast of a subdiscipline, which kind of drove Zoe and I both insane this summer.
Not to like make it maybe a bigger deal than it is, but it sort of like affects everything. Media is, one could argue, like all things are media, or at least all things are communication in some form.
My mind is currently dominated by confusion. I think that this topic is, yeah.
It is quite a quagmire.
From the late 90s up into the 2010s, however, the field had begun to focus on what I'll refer to in this video as an educational approach to media literacy, governed by that definition from Namely I read just a minute ago. In this conception, media literacy is something that we can teach people, a kind of modern critical thinking toolkit. To clarify this a little further, I think it's helpful to look at Hobbs and Jensen's analysis of Namely's core principles, which help them to define media literacy not just by what it is, but also by what it isn't. Though they don't want to excuse media makers of their broader responsibilities to society, they also are clear to point out that media literacy is not a place for media bashing or a leftist ideological perspective on media systems. Instead, they view their role as teaching students how they can arrive at informed decisions that are most consistent with their own values. More on this later. This educational approach is the media literacy that I grew up with, and based on my viewer demographics, if you got any media literacy education when you were growing up, it probably looked like this too. You probably had an emphasis on research skills and finding trusted sources. For me, once a semester, we would have one English or history class where we'd go down to the library and be told that Wikipedia is bad, actually. The focus is on students thinking critically about media they consume, rather than being critical of media. And though I'm teeing us up for a criticism of this in a second here, it's not because I hate it or because I think it's ineffective even. I respect Renee Hobbs and the other scholars whose work I have cited in this video a lot. And it's clear to me that media literacy education has made massive advances in the last 30 years, proving that when done right, this stuff really works. In one study in 2017, over 2,000 youth ages 15 to 27 were shown a sample of evidence-based social media posts mixed in with posts with misinformation. The study found that those with media literacy education were better at identifying misinformation and at avoiding ideological bias. And it seems that this effect wasn't just a product of education, but media literacy education specifically. They found in the same study that other education, like prior political knowledge, didn't have the same protective effect as media literacy education. Contrary to conventional wisdom, this study also indicates that political knowledge is an insufficient support for accurate judgments of partisan claims. In contrast to these findings regarding political knowledge, we were heartened that media literacy learning experiences that aim to promote accurate judgment of truth claims appear to be helpful. Individuals who reported high levels of media literacy learning opportunities were considerably more likely to rate evidence-based posts as accurate than to rate posts containing misinformation as accurate, even when both posts aligned with their prior policy perspectives. And similar studies have shown that news media literacy can help adults to identify conspiracy theories. Another study from that same year of 400 adults found that greater knowledge about the news media predicted a lower likelihood of conspiracy theory endorsement, even for conspiracy theories that aligned with their political ideology. There are many such studies that show this type of efficacy for media literacy, that when it's done right, it helps people believe lies less often, which is really great. And most impressively to me, when it doesn't work, the field seems genuinely interested in understanding why and finding a way to make it function better. In their discussion of a study by Weinberg and McGrew, Monica Bulger and Patrick Davison point out that not all media literacy education is created equally. The study compared how PhD historians, professional fact-checkers, and Stanford University undergraduates evaluated online social and political information. They found that while historians and students used trust metrics that could easily be gamed or manipulated, e.g. look of a website, domain names, logos, professional fact-checkers would leave the website to quickly research its validity. Not all media literacy skills are created equally. Sure, some are still more likely to lead you to get tricked than others, but that doesn't mean we should throw out the whole field just because we found some problems. Current gaps could in fact be addressed by consulting disciplines that have already had to confront truth as an existential problem, like fact-checkers and librarians. You're watching a video essay right now, so I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that you probably find this exciting, or at the very least, encouraging, cool, or mildly interesting. We're living right now at the start of a potential golden age for understanding how media impact us, both personally and socially. And part of what makes that excitement so palpable is that there are massive online communities of people who eat this shit up and care about getting the details right.
As a YouTuber, I am doing media literacy, and when people watch my videos and respond to them, they are performing media literacy to some extent or another.
There's a very good chance that you care about media literacy because in the last half-decade, you've seen some of the greatest hits of online misinformation debunking. We have pieces correcting historical inaccuracies, drawing attention to online propaganda, and a veritable subgenre of PragerU takedowns. There is potentially the largest energy behind media literacy there ever has been in history. But with this excitement, there's a bit of a double-edged sword that we have to be aware of, and that's actually why I'm making this video. When Larry approached us at that gas station in 2021, I sincerely believed that I was going to have what it takes to convince him that the things he believed were incorrect, that he had fallen for misinformation. I thought that I was going to be well-equipped enough to refute all of his points. I'd seen enough misinformation debunkings, surely I could lead him to the light. But that isn't what happened. Because, you see, for every second that Larry and I spoke to each other, there were dozens of hours of content behind what each of us were saying. An entire media reality filled with factoids, arguments, and talking points that were bouncing around in each of our heads. It is very unlikely that in the span of that one conversation, I was ever going to outweigh the entirety of Larry's media diet. I had it all wrong, and there's a chance that you might too. Media literacy is good, but I don't think that it can be the thing that saves us from misinformation. At least not on its own. When so much human interaction is dictated by media, we can't just teach people to read that media critically and call it a day and say that misinformation is solved. At some point, we have to ask some uncomfortable questions about what they're watching, how it got to them, and who made it. At some point, we can't just ask about media as an incidental component of education. At some point, we have to talk about it as if it is reality itself. We have to think of media not just as an object, but as an environment. A year and a half after claiming that Karen McDougal had extorted Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson went on to become the most watched host on cable news. Between June 8th and June 14th, 2020, he was averaging an audience of 4 million, with 680,000 of those in the coveted 25 to 54 demographic. Several advertisers were boycotting him at the time over his statements on the Black Lives Matter protests.
This may be a lot of things, this moment we're living through, but it is definitely not about Black lives. And remember that when they come for you, and at this rate, they will.
But Fox claims that all national advertising dollars and ads were moved to other programs on the network, with no net loss of ad dollars. Their quarterly report supports this claim as well, with a nearly $700 million year-over-year increase in television. Yes, Tucker Carlson generated plenty of bad press for Fox in 2020, but this didn't make him a liability. He was a massive asset. In the month that Karen McDougal's lawsuit was dismissed, he averaged 4.6 million viewers, once again the most watched host in cable news, and briefly before that, the most watched host in cable news ever. Karen McDougal's lawsuit was dismissed by U.S. District Judge Mary Kay Viscoso, who 9 months earlier had been appointed to that position by Donald Trump. She dismissed the suit because McDougal had not offered a plausible interpretation that the statements Mr. Carlson made, when read in context, are statements of fact. Additionally, since Karen McDougal was a public figure, she had to provide a plausible inference of actual malice in what Tucker Carlson had said. I want to point out briefly, so I don't get a bunch of law bros in the chat, that I don't think McDougal was ever going to win this suit, even if it had gone in front of a more sympathetic judge, because of the stringent standards applied to defamation suits. But still, how is Tucker Carlson saying,
remember the facts of the story, these are undisputed,
not a statement of fact? Well, according to Viscoso, it's because earlier in this segment, he said that he was parroting the opinions of Michael Cohen for the sake of argument.
Now, assuming honesty isn't usually a wise idea with Michael Cohen, but for the sake of argument, let's do it in this case. Everything he says is true. Why is what Cohen is alleging a criminal offense? Remember the facts of the story, these are undisputed.
Since he had claimed earlier in the piece he was going to review something for the sake of argument, a reasonable viewer should obviously not confuse this for a statement of fact, right? But in normal human speech, if someone says that they're saying something for the sake of argument, but then interrupts themselves and says, remember the facts of the story, these are undisputed, wouldn't you expect that the next thing that they say is true? My point here, I guess, is that the legal standard by which we assess what lies are allowed and which lies are not doesn't map perfectly onto the way that people actually speak. Because, for the record, what Tucker Carlson said isn't true. To public knowledge, McDougal never approached Trump. Her story was purchased by the National Enquirer because its owner, David Pecker, was a friend of Donald Trump's and wanted to keep it from going public, a tactic known as catch and kill. So here we have a media system that buries stories for its political allies. When those stories come to light anyway, it attempts to discredit them with misleading statements. When those misleading statements get challenged for legal harm, they hire top lawyers with their record-breaking ad revenue. Those lawyers' arguments are then assessed on a stringent legal standard by a sympathetic judge who was appointed by a political ally. And when that judge clears the air, the oppositional press snidely remarks that a guy who has way more reach than any of them ever will admits that he lies sometimes, as if that's a fucking victory. And the antidote to all of this, the way to stop the rich and powerful from spreading lies, is supposed to be media literacy. Let's start this next section by playing a round of my favorite game. It's called, Has Anything Like This Ever Happened Before? Spoiler alert, the answer is almost always yes. In 1922, political columnist Walter Lippmann wrote a book called Public Opinion. Here's a quote. It is interesting to note that the general reader of a newspaper has no standing in law if he thinks he's being misled by the news. It is only the aggrieved party who can sue for slander or libel, and he has to prove a material injury to himself. The law embodies the tradition that general news is not a matter of common concern. Lippmann was troubled by the way that the French and American governments had edited and censored various communications during World War I, and he wrote Public Opinion to attempt to impart how fragile public opinion truly is, and how powerful the media can be in shaping it, even in 1922. His comment on defamation laws isn't some call for all lying to be illegal or something. Rather, he wants readers to notice that some lies are legal and some lies aren't. The choice as to which lies we have laws against and which lies we don't is just that, a choice. We create our media ecosystem through active decision-making. Inspired by this, I want to balance the educational approach to media literacy we discussed in part 1 with what I'll call an ecological approach. Lance Straight of the Media Ecology Association defines media ecology as the study of media as media. That's a little unclear though, so he uses a metaphor of a billiards game to elaborate on what he means by that. When someone asks us what happens in a game of billiards, we're likely to talk about the turns that the players took, the movement of the balls on the table, their collisions with each other, who won the game, details of the actual game itself. we could consider this the content of a game of billiards. But a media ecologist may ask you instead to focus on the table that the games are played on. The table has a certain shape, and the pockets are in a certain location, and these details inform the rules and what turns the players might take and in what order. In this way, the structure of the table changes the content of every game of billiards. We can apply this same type of thinking to media to great effect. A television program, for example, has words, images, and sounds that appear from the speakers and on your screen that are the content, which we can analyze all we want. But we shouldn't become so focused with what's on the screen that we forget that the screen is there altogether, or that someone owns the rights to the airwaves, the cameras that recorded the show, and the contracts with the performers. Television is a medium, and its structure changes the content of every television program. But you might ask, why do I care about all of this esoteric bullshit when it comes to media literacy? Well, I'd argue that being able to understand the medium as opposed to content is probably the most important media literacy skill you can develop. But if you're anything like me, the media literacy education that you grew up with was very heavy on content analysis and not so heavy on medium analysis. We're taught to verify claims, review sources, research the authenticity of a piece's author, which are all great ways for telling if content is trustworthy. But what do we do if a medium is designed in such a way that it incentivizes misinformation at a rate we could never account for with education? This problem has been noticed by many before me. I am far from the first to realize this. As early as 1950, for example, theorists Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno were noting that the film and radio industries were incredibly dependent on investment from large corporations and banks, and that as a consequence of this, they began to reflect the political interests of their investors. The dependence of the most powerful broadcasting company on the electrical industry, or of film on the banks, characterizes the whole sphere, the individual sectors of which are themselves economically intertwined. The relentless unity of the culture industry bears witness to the emergent unity of politics. In 1987, Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman took this a little bit further with their book, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, which was a collection of case studies of the type of influence Adorno and Horkheimer were talking about. They laid out a 5-filter propaganda model to describe the continuous alignment of news media with the United States government and its corporate allies. In one particularly telling example, they note how a public media station was incentivized to no longer criticize large corporations. Public television station WNET lost its corporate funding from Gulf and Western in 1985, after the station showed the documentary Hungry for Profit, which contains material critical of multinational corporate activities in the Third World. The London Economist says that most people believe that WNET would not make the same mistake again. And modern writers and journalists have expanded on this idea yet again, describing how large tech companies have taken this type of control over the media and put it in fewer hands than ever before. Several pieces have noted the influence that one man, Joel Kaplan, has had at Meta as their VP of Global Public Policy. He's lobbied against more accurate human moderation, he's invited conservative figures to meet with top Facebook officials, and even gone so far as to say that the site shouldn't remove disinformation because it would disproportionately affect conservatives. When control over information is so concentrated that one man can change what billions of people see and hear, it's really hard for me to believe that education is going to stop that type of influence. In all of these examples, the medium sprays out misinformation faster than we could ever hope to educate people to spot it. To make it clear, this is why I've been foaming at the mouth about Tucker Carlson in this video. At one point, I think he epitomized misinformation for a lot of people, but he is not the last, and he won't be the worst to do so. Tucker is a temporary avatar for a timeless issue, not an aberration of the system, but part of its design. Modern media literacy scholars have been aware of this for a while. I don't want to pretend like I'm pointing it out to them for the first time, but they do all seem to have some question marks as to what to actually do about it, or what it means for media literacy. Earlier, I quoted this 2018 piece by Monica Bulger and Patrick Davison. They're actually a little bit groundbreaking in this regard, as they're willing to literally come out and say that they don't think media literacy is sufficient to solve the problems of misinformation. Later that same year, the Journal of Media Literacy Education had a special edition focused on fake news, misinformation, and democracy, and the guest editors, in an introductory piece, called explicitly for a media ecology approach to the problem. They note that we must explore how new media technologies create new possibilities for social and political engagement, while affecting existing media dynamics in both positive and negative ways. In a media ecology approach, then, we can't just say that the problem is the media, or sensationalism. And we can't just say that the solution is education or telling the truth. Rather, we need to focus on the specific features of the various media that we use to communicate, and try to understand how they create or encourage misinformation. Zoe helped me with an introductory example of this, by noting how the ecology of YouTube may influence more decisions about your favorite video essays than you once thought.
I definitely do care about the algorithm as much as I hate that I have to. But I do, and that's just the reality of being a content creator, that you need the spice. You need something that people are gonna get like upset with. You need, the like bright colors and just very like appealing things on your thumbnail. I have made a marked change in how I do my intros to my videos, where I used to write like a writer instead of writing like a YouTuber, and now I've learned how to write like a YouTuber, where I get to the point as quickly as possible. The way that I sort of like organize my arguments is very intentional. There's also just the more like we live in a world things where I have to do like ad integrations in videos, and I don't like that I have to do it, but I do. And I have to think about where I put mid-roll ads. So yeah, I mean, it's frustrating, but you gotta do what you gotta do, I suppose.
You kind of talked about every part of a video there.
Yeah.
The title, the thumbnail, the intro, the ads, the way you fund it, all of this stuff. For a lot of people like that are consumers of video essays, there's a way that you make it very seamless. You make it very like, this is the show and this is the product and I have written it and it is for you. But at every moment, there's like a negotiation, a balancing act that you're playing with the platform and the algorithm. And would that be a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah, it is a negotiation.
I want to be really clear with this, that I'm not saying that this means all video essayists are untrustworthy or that they're lying to you. Again, I think many of them are critical to modern media literacy. But when we're sharing all of this work on a platform owned by Google, we have to try really hard to remember that content analysis alone may not be sufficient. The best example I found of this in the academic literature came from James Cohen in a piece on ecosystems. Cohen notes that interactive, individualized, algorithmically driven media, like the internet, can pose unique problems for misinformation and polarization. As a case study, he analyzes the story of Dylan Roof to show how, unlike previous generations of technology, the internet can track your behavior and feed it back to you through things like cookies on the websites you visit. Content warning here for white supremacy, mass violence, and death. In the Southern Poverty Law Center's investigation into Dylan Roof's heinous hate crime of murdering 9 African-American citizens in a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, the SPLC discovered traces of his radicalization through Google search results. In his manifesto, Roof writes that he was prompted to type in the words black on white crime into Google, and I have never been the same since that day. Simply clicking on the link permanently altered his media environment. As soon as the site loaded, the malicious site's cookies were downloaded on Roof's hard drive. The next time Dylan Roof made a Google search in a similar category, it used his previous search history to inform his results. As Roof sought out information to confirm his biases, the search results customized, displaying a unique media feed for Roof that persisted across various digital platforms. This type of analysis is critical not just because it's sobering, but because it reminds us of the influence of the medium. If we want to understand how the internet has uniquely radicalized the public and spread misinformation, we can't just look at individual pieces of content. No amount of PragerU debunkings can fix the internet's designed proclivity for misinformation. What I'm advocating for here then is solutions that fit the medium. And in the modern day, that would look like, well, actually, what would that look like? We can't rely solely on education to fix the problem of misinformation. We also have to look at our current media ecology and advocate for things that would make it better. Before I talk about that though, I want to make one final note on media literacy education. In this video, I've been mildly critical of media literacy education, but I want to make clear that this really isn't a takedown. I continue to think that the teachers and advocates who push for media literacy education are doing something incredibly valuable. I think we ultimately want the same thing, but are talking about 2 different ways of getting at it that need to be able to complement each other and work together. An educational approach and an ecological approach. And I also don't think it's quite as simple as me saying that their solution is individualistic and mine is systemic. There are plenty of ways to make systemic changes to education. For example, the national policy push for media literacy education in classrooms, which you can learn more about from the group Media Literacy Now, who has a map documenting where media literacy education exists in the United States and at what level. But education can't fix everything on its own. Misinformation can't just be another problem that we ask teachers to solve for us. And given the scale of the modern media's influence over all of us, I think we must analyze the technologies, regulations, and business models that create our media environment. One thing I couldn't ignore when reviewing educational materials then was that a lot of them entirely avoid describing media ecology or being critical of media systems. I touched on this earlier, but I want to talk now about why I think that's actually doing a bit of a disservice to learners. And as an example, to make this clear, I want to talk about this resource that Namely has shared for parents, teaching them how to talk about media with their kids. It takes an educational approach through and through, focused on guided inquiry to help students come to their own conclusions. They suggest that parents should ask questions and encourage their kids to think about the media products they're consuming. But why not also actively encourage skepticism about media products that are untrustworthy? Take this example where a father and his son have a conversation about ads. The son really wants a new toy, but the dad asks questions until his son realizes that ads sometimes make things look cooler than they actually are. It's educational best practice at its best, guided inquiry that helps the kid come to their own conclusion. That's all well and good, but what if your son isn't capable of coming to this skeptical, literate conclusion on his own? Why not say at some point, hey, by the way, advertisers exist and they want your money. They want to sell you things. I think we do a disservice when we don't come out and say that certain media are not designed with our best interests in mind. Sometimes we must make our view on ecology explicit, even if it feels like telling people what to think as opposed to how to think. This is a point that Zoe and I went back and forth on a lot when talking about these educational and ecological approaches and their differences.
If you are going to pursue media literacy directly, it is easier to do that on an individual level. But I think that there are some systemic problems that, if you pursue them for the sake of helping to fix issues with media literacy, I don't think that's a very good reason to do them. But I think that if you fix them for other reasons, like fixing the education system because it's dehumanizing to students, or fixing the regulations on media industries because they need them, I think that that's a good thing. Like, I think that there are systemic things that we should fix because they need fixed, not necessarily as a media literacy solution, even though it would help fix some issues with media literacy sort of downstream.
What do you think about teaching people about the operations of media industries, doing some of this critical media literacy education in the educational context in this more concrete way?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I think we need more of, because there is a lot of talk of we need more media literacy classes, and it's yeah, but what are you actually teaching them? How would those media literacy classes be any different than, say, an English class? Because I think that is what you're getting at, is the first approach, which is the just asking your children or your students to ask questions. That's a very English teacher, that's the English class approach to interacting with media. Whereas I think that critical media literacy angle is what would make that media literacy class actually important and relevant on its own, is that systemic view of things.
But even changing our education like this wouldn't be a true ecological solution. Ecological solutions require us to use technology or regulations to change the structure of a medium, to prevent it from repeating the harms that we know it's made before. My favorite version of this advocacy comes from Zeynep Tufekci, who in a 2022 piece argued for a right to general data privacy in the US as a means to combat misinformation. Here's a quote. "Perhaps a starting point would be to make it harder and less lucrative to lie to huge audiences. Rather than pursuing legally dubious and inadvisable efforts to ban speech or define and target misinformation, regulations should target the incentives for and the speed with which lies can be spread, amplified, and monetized. One part of the solution might be to target reckless data surveillance online by greatly limiting how much data can be collected, how long it can be retained, what it can be used for, and how it can be traded. Among other benefits, this could make chasing engagement less attractive as a business model." I like this type of regulation because it specifically targets one of the novel harms of internet media, in this case, massive data targeting. If something like this were enacted, it could change our media environment for the better without having to pass 1,000 rules about what you can and can't say online. If data were less plentiful, then online advertising would be less attractive for advertisers. This would divert some amount of advertising money back into local media, which would bolster that and diversify the media that we all consume. It would also change the media we see by changing our social media feeds, keeping us from being targeted by malicious actors or just normal advertisers. A data privacy regulation would, in my opinion, be the holy grail of ecological solutions for misinformation. But I also want to recognize that this type of regulation is probably entirely unpassable in the United States. I've talked before on this channel about how tech companies are kind of perfectly designed for the modern regulatory apparatus. And there's no chance in hell that something like this would get passed. There's simply way too much money on the line. So we probably need to focus on protecting each other more than hoping that someone else will come and save us. One historical example I found of this came from a really excellent JSTOR blog piece by Alexandra Samuel. It documents the history of the first journalistic ethics codes in the United States as an effective means of curtailing misinformation, which was a huge problem in the era of yellow journalism. The codes made formal definitions for things like advertisements, opinion pieces, and news, and required their signatories to cease the publication of false quotations and interviews. There's even evidence that this reduced misinformation at the time in the form of false publications. We're right now finding ourselves in a similar shift that was happening at the end of the 19th century, where new ad money is flooding in and supporting a generation of writers that previously couldn't have done what they do. The era of edutainment has brought some great writers and educators forward, but as their audiences grow and more people rely on them for information, they have an increased responsibility to produce that information responsibly. An ethics code for a new medium, ratified by content creators and internet publishers, might be a step in the right direction. So these would both be really helpful solutions that recognize ecology, that recognize the shift in the media landscape. But we also have to be careful that just because something sounds like it recognizes ecology doesn't mean that it's actually a good ecological solution. There are lots of things that use the language of ecological solutions when they are in fact just bad. For example, fighting misinformation can often get dangerously close to censorship. I'm generally not one to believe that the elites are gonna 1984 My Brave New World or something, but I don't like regulations like COSA, the proposed Kids Online Safety Act. COSA claims to protect children by giving state attorneys general a mandate to prevent and mitigate the harms of social media platforms, but this is not the type of regulation we should be going after to fight misinformation. It gives too much power to too few people to control speech, codifying the problem I'm describing here, not fixing it. I am not content to replace Mark Zuckerberg with the United States government and call it a day. And I'm really especially not excited to do it when one of the bill's sponsors has referred to education on racial discrimination as dangerous for kids. Additionally, I'm not convinced that scolding people about what they watch is an effective ecological solution either. On a recent episode of the Search Engine podcast, Vox founder Ezra Klein offers a kind of vote with your eyeballs model of media salvation. You know, with small media outlets closing and local publishers failing, maybe we should support small media outlets and watch local news.
In your mix, there should be local news. If you're a news consumer, local news should exist somewhere in that.
At time of recording, I literally work in public media fundraising, and even I think that this is a cop-out. Those things are important. There's a link below to donate to your local public media station, but offering that as a theory of change is just obviously insufficient when social media is many orders of magnitude larger than all local media combined. Not to mention that voting with your eyeballs still just keeps power among people who have money, people who can afford to support local outlets and local news. We have to be careful then that the language of ecological solutions doesn't blind us to obvious problems. When we tinker with the machinery of information, the consequences can be enormous, so we have to make changes very deliberately and carefully. Ultimately, the problem is really complex and annoying. We find ourselves in something of a media forest fire where misinformation burns through everything, kindled by an unhealthy media ecology. Fixing that will be hard to say the least, so it makes sense to me that people turn to solutions like media literacy to save us. But there are things that media literacy can't fix. Okay, so not to sound like a communications major or something, but I ended up rereading Manufacturing Consent for the first time since college while I was writing this video, and I want to leave you with something from it that really stood out to me this time around. In their section titled Conclusions, Chomsky and Herman say that we need to vigorously oppose the steady commercialization of the publicly owned airwaves. This was actually a really popular progressive idea in the 20th century, that the various frequencies that make up the modern miracle of mass communication are a public good and that they should be used for the benefit of the people. Perhaps they should even have a say in how those airwaves are used, what kind of media is put on them, and that the continued commercialization of that media was not good for people. Today, however, very few people take up this argument. No one really takes the suggestion that media is a public good seriously. It's seen as naive, boring, moralizing, what do you want, a bunch of opera and kids shows on TV? I don't think we should go that far, but I do think we're currently living through the logical consequences of what happens when the airwaves are reserved for dopamine and profit. Ultimately, I chose to focus on ecological solutions in this video because I think we forget that things don't have to be this way. This whole world of media that we see around us was all made by some dummy like you or me, and maybe, if we want to, we could change it. Hi, oh god. Hello, welcome to the conclusion of the video. Thank you for watching. I want to make a quick shout out to Zoe B for being in the video and for going insane about media literacy with me for several months, and also just being a good friend generally. Also a quick shout out to everyone who's come over from her channel or from Unlearning Economics recently. Glad to have you. This video was originally supposed to be kind of a shorter one, but then it ended up taking me like 3 months, which is true of every video I've posted this year, so I've kind of come to the conclusion that this is not a sustainable pattern and that I need to change the way that I am making these, so keep an eye out for some relatively large changes coming soon. For now though, enjoy the fall. I hope your summers were nice. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.